Is the mic on? Check. Mic check 1 2. Hello, folks. So first up, I'm a streaming engineer. That's probably going to make some of you feel comfortable because I'm actually an engineer from first principles. 30 years building streaming systems. CDNs is my sort of speciality, and I still run a software company which delivers live streaming platforms. But a couple of years ago, as part of discussions in CDN conferences, I started off discussions about sustainability, and surprisingly, 2018, 2019, the architects of BBC, Disney, Netflix, they all shrugged their shoulders and said, I've got no idea how sustainable we are. In fact, I've got no idea what colour the electrons my finance director buys are. And so we started a discussion which grew into a members association. So do I need to click? Let me click. So the association is known as Greening of Streaming. It's named after an article I wrote about it for our magazine. These are our current members, and we're growing about one a month at the moment. We're 2.5 years old, or 2 years, 2.5 years old. Obviously, Microsoft sort of very pleased that they announced 2 months ago, a month ago, that they've joined us, and it takes a long time to ramp them up. We've also got Lumen over in the bottom corner who came on at the beginning of this year. So significant network actors in terms of distribution, but also actors right through the supply chain of streaming. Just to touch, sort of follow on from what Alice has been talking about. I can look there, can't I? Just to touch, sort of continue on what Alice has been sort of mentioning with specific focus on streaming. So I'm very tight about figures. I don't like figures, and I can go into more depth about that later. But the figures that I would sit on, the IEA, which is probably the most conservative of all these statistics, estimates that data centers are probably running at about 2% of global final electricity supply, and telecoms as well, which gets forgotten about because you can fly a drone over a data center and point panorama at them, but you can't fly a drone over a telecoms network, but it's using about 3% of global final electricity supply. So the figure from the IEA is about 5%. The other figure that you can kind of jam into that, and I emphasize jam into that, is that Cisco and Sandvine and others estimate 70 to 80% of network traffic is video at the moment. So you could argue that that network video is driving a demand for somewhere around 3% of global final electricity supply. So whatever the actual figures are, the important thing is it's quite a significant magnitude. We're still quite a small industry. I think I'm connected to most of you, and it's about 6,000 people on my LinkedIn profile. So we still actually can get us into a conference centre and have a conversation about doing something. And that's what Greening of Streaming has set out to do. The organisation itself has a few sort of basic key points. No greenwashing is our only rule. It was tongue-in-cheek when we put it in there. It's become the soul of the whole thing, if you can have a soul as an organisation these days. But basically, as members have joined us, they've completely radically changed their marketing. So you can't win sustainability. You cannot be the most sustainable company. And if anyone tells me that, I'll give them a good kicking, because you can't. You can't be the last person after the apocalypse saying, I won. It just won't work. Okay, so through this no greenwashing rule, the organisations have moderated their marketing and are focusing on collaboration, on taking developing a systemic understanding through the entire supply chain, and then making real change through education and engineering. So it is interesting watching how companies change as they've been joining us, and I've been quite proud of that. We're member-led, we're not for profit, we're a user group, we're not a standards organisation. We have close association with SMPTE, with DTG, with DPP, all these other organisations where we're encouraging them to go back to basics and think about energy. And I'll come back to this. We do have a focus on operational energy. Rather surprisingly, given the name of the organisation, we don't really talk about carbon. So I'm sorry Alice is not in the room here. As engineers, I couldn't find an engineer who knew what carbon was. And I certainly couldn't find an engineer who could do anything about it. But we all know what operational energy is. We all know what watts are. We know what kilowatt hours are. And we can actually turn dials and do something about that. So we're focused on that, but we do have fabricators, we do have telecoms infrastructure providers, we have compute hosting people in the organisation who sit in the working groups and tap us on the shoulder and say, yeah, that's a nice idea operationally, but you haven't thought about the fact that you've got to manufacture 70 million FPGAs next year. So we do think about embedded emissions and the carbon impacts, but they're not something we can directly affect through software engineering in the streaming space. The organisation's got 8 working groups up and running. I'm not going to go into the details because I specifically want to talk about the Less Accord today, but just to touch briefly on them, we've got our first working group is on lexicon, so there's a lot of differences of measurement and opinion in the industry. People were talking about numbers of times you've got to drive to Saturn while watching an iPad playing Peppa Pig in the back of an SUV, or numbers of kilograms of carbon per frame of video and so on. It was all over the place. It was really nonsense. So working group 1 is focused on language and measurement. We've produced a paper on watts and what watts means to different people in the supply chain, kilowatt hours conversions and all these sort of things. Currently it's working on a survey looking at power off, sleep and standby, which are glibly used in the industry, but we've got 40, 50 responses to the survey, and if you're interested, please chip yours in. No 2 are the same. You know, chip vendors think of sleep as an inter-processing cycle, whereas set-top box manufacturers think of sleep as dimming the red light on the front of the box and so on. So there's a lot of disparity in those terms. Working Group 2 is all about awareness, doing stuff like this, developing awareness of the issues, speaking at conferences, organising events, and so on. It also functions. We take it on ourselves to put ourselves in front of policymakers. A lot of emerging policy has completely failed to talk to the industry. So there are people coming up with, and I'll detail a little bit more of this in a second, there are people telling the industry how it works and telling it what power it's using. And if you actually ask the industry practitioners, how does it work, they go, I don't know, we can't measure that yet. So we're at a point where we don't understand ourselves, and we're being told how our industry works by passers-by, frankly. So that's an important role we take with policymakers, is to get them engaged with the industry directly. So if they're thinking about policy in this space, they can actually talk to the industry and understand what's really going on. Working Group 3 will be our long-term aim. It's the best practices working group. We don't have any needles yet, so we don't know how to move them. We certainly don't know how to promote any best practice. Barbara Lang's ex-SIMT director is looking after that working group. It also doubles up as our governance group, just making sure that we run processes internally in the organisation fairly. Expect some best practice document to appear probably early next year. I would have thought is the first time we'll actually have some data, and Tommy, you can hold me to that. We'll actually have some data which we'd feel comfortable to support and share. Working Group 3 is meaty, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. We have an audio working group, and the decompression working group looks at codecs. So obviously, one of the places that we use a lot of energy is in computation, which is used in is all in layer 4. So it's codecs, compression, packaging, security, all of these things. That's all happening in Working Group 6. Working Group 7 is our liaison with standards organisations, and we're working at the moment with the SVTA to extend their capacity insights element of their open caching protocol, so that you can include, as well as price and performance metrics in your routing decisions, you can also include energy decisions or energy-based decisions. And then the final working group's our academic liaison working group, which is nicknamed the dating agency between industry and academia. We've got about 15 academic groups who we have lots of discussion with. And then over the top of all the working groups, we have something which has emerged this year called the Less Accord, the Low Energy Sustainable Streaming Accord. Let me just give you a little bit of preface before we go into the detail on the Less Accord. So we've made some interesting discoveries, and this is, I mentioned a second ago, Working Group 4. You can't see the detail on this diagram, but this diagram is a live streaming workflow. It's what I've worked with since 1996. These are all the boxes you would need to plug in to replace the internet, to replace everything in your streaming workflow if you didn't have an internet. And so these are the switches and routers and amplifiers and street boxes and everything that gets your stream from your encoders through to your set-top box or your iPhone or whatever you're watching the stream on. And it's logically schematic, so this last mile will work for Wi-Fi or wireless LAN or DSL or whatever. We drew this diagram up because a lot of the climate science has been making a correlation between traffic and energy. And I had some concerns about that. And when you dig into it, there's a model called data attribution, which essentially is easiest explained if you think about this last mile router here. If that's a 100 meg router burning 100 watts and you pull 10 megabits of Netflix, Disney, BBC, whatever through it, that broadcaster will attribute 10 watts of the 100 watts that's being used by the router to their service, and then they'll work to reduce that as part of their net zero strategy or whatever it may be. So they'll halve their bit rate. And I'll say, great, I'm doing 5 megabits, I'm now doing 5 watts. I'm twice as sustainable as I used to be, I'm on my way to net zero. Problem is, any engineer will immediately point out that the router's still using 100 watts, nothing changed. So we've explored this in depth, and we've got networks like Lumen and Akamai now instrumenting Atom, Broadpeak and so on right through the network, and we are looking for correlations between big spikes in traffic for World Cup final, European Champions League final, and to see if we can spot any spikes in energy. We are taking that data and giving it to academics who've fundamentally created the data attribution model so that they can correct and edit their science because they didn't have any data. While we're not in a position where we've got that data back from the academics, and we're only going to publish data that's essentially come back, or analysis that's come back from academia, so we don't fall foul of our own no greenwashing rule, the early indication is you can't spot any energy variation when you vary traffic. No traffic and all the traffic doesn't change the network energy. And this is reasonably shocking if your entire net zero strategy is based on this idea that 1 gigabyte equals 1 kilogram of carbon, because it doesn't. And this is a problem. PwC, Ernst & Young, they are already accounting public companies based on 1 gigabyte equals 1 kilogram of carbon. And it kind of makes me a bit angry because we've kind of rocketed off down the wrong path. So I've essentially just run through that slide. I nickname it the Galileo moment because I feel a little bit like I'm trying to point out we're in a heliocentric universe to a bunch of people who think the world revolves around the sun revolves around the Earth. It's not all bad news. In the last couple of weeks, we've been talking in depth to core peering, core transit providers and so on. It's kind of interesting. There was an assumption until a couple of weeks ago, I'll hold my hand up to this, that you go from 4G to 5G, you go from 1x power to 3x power, but you maybe get a tenfold capacity increase as you go through your network generation change. The more we dig into it, certainly in the fiber world, it is actually looking like as you go from 1x to 10x capacity, you might even be going down in power because network technologies are getting that much more efficient, which then begs the question of how quickly you can move your traffic to the new network and what do you do about all the carbon you've invested in digging and ducting the old network. So it's incredibly complex at what point you do these transitions. But despite the network element being in deep investigation and in question, there are all sorts of other areas that the streaming industry operates, particularly in layer 4. And these are all areas that we are exploring in working groups, looking at how much energy we can save through these different processes. So I'm not going to go through these one by one, but I'm pretty sure you can sort of see that the streaming industry adds a lot of energy on top of the network, whichever way you look at it. So let's get to the kind of key thing that I wanted to talk about. At IBC this year, we were talking about, actually in Working Group 6, the compression group, we were talking about, what are the effects of things like green buttons. So I don't know if you've heard of green button models. So green button's kind of like the red button idea. You're watching a TV, you hit a green button, and suddenly everything's in eco mode. Same as eco mode, if you like. Strangely, we did some surveys for our Parliament launch actually last year, and surveyed about 2,000 members of the public. Strangely, people don't buy a 4K TV and then cripple it. And effectively, eco mode, hitting your green button is effectively crippling your quality. Here's your 4K picture, but I want to make it green. I'm going to dim the brightness, I'm going to lower the resolution, I'm going to do it. Why did I buy a 4K TV in the first place? It's just the way that the world is. So we started kicking around the idea of flipping that on its head. And is there a model to have a gold button? It was clear from the survey that the consumer expects the industry to solve this problem. The broadcaster would really like to think this is the consumer's problem. It's all down, looking back to the previous presentation, it's right the other end of the scoping. It's not my problem, it's down to the consumer and what device they choose to connect to this stuff. That's where all the energy's burnt. It's really good that all the data that came out of the early labs, while we didn't have any network measurement, looked like all the energy was being burnt in the set-top box. Forgetting the internet, that's just a sort of trivial magic cloud. It doesn't have any energy. The set-top box is far away from the broadcaster. We can point the finger at the broadcaster, far away from the broadcaster, so the broadcaster can point the finger at the consumer and wash their hands of the problem. It's nicely in scope 3. We're on our way to net zero. It's not working like that, folks. We are the industry that gives a menu of technology choices to the consumer, and if we decide to only give them an energy efficient solution, that's all they get. And we can actually edict that because we're engineers, and that's the privilege of being an engineer. So we started thinking about this gold button idea, and what if we just mandated, we're going to deliver everything, the first stream you get when you channel hop, the first thing you pull out of a CDN cache is going to be, for example, and it is, I heavily emphasize, for example, it's going to be a 2K H.264 stream at 30 frames a second. Oh my God, the UHD people just walked out of the room, and all the people who've got HDR just walked out of the room. Okay, fine. But if we mandated that, would it make a difference at scale to 30 million households, or whatever your footprint is? Would it make a difference to energy? If so, would people care? What are the ideas out there? So we nicknamed it for a while the Gold Button Project. It was flipping the green button on its head. I opt into my UHD when I'm actually watching the screen, but when I turn the TV on to watch the news while I'm cooking, it'll come on in the most energy optimized format. And that's the principle of thinking that's evolved into the low energy sustainable streaming accord, or the LESS accord. And we also didn't want to just talk and measure and pontificate. I want our group to do something. There's a lot of measurement and there's a lot of talk going on, and there's not actually a lot of action. Net zero is, in my opinion, largely an accounting thing. In any way, even if you achieve net zero, you're only in stasis. You're not reducing anything. It's not a degrowth strategy. It's not really going to get us where we need to be. So let's make the industry do something. So I'm inviting you all to get involved in the LESS Accord. I'll put up a QR code in a minute, or a URL. We're canvassing that entire industry for wacky ideas, brainstorm. Let's get intuitive guesses into the mix. It's not just about bandwidth reduction. It might be about choice of codec. It might be about rollout of new kit. There's all sorts of ways and all sorts of interests across the industry who might have good ideas, and we want to hear them all. We're gathering those in, and at the end of May, we're going to get our members together and we're going to pick the best 3 or 4 of those ideas. And then we have an annual policy-facing event, and our mission is to show that we're leading industry-led reform, or what used to be called self-regulation. We don't need policy, we're doing it already. So we're going to get together in the European Parliament as a group of members, inviting BEREC, inviting Ofcom, all the regulators and people to come and see what we're doing and ask questions, get involved if they want to. And we're going to try and put these 3 or 4 ideas into test frameworks amongst our members. Our members are running these things, or can run these things in production, and model out, okay, let's take DAZN's network, let's take 20,000 of the 40,000 people watching a tennis game, and let's give them 2K, 25 frame a second H.264, and see if it saves any energy, and importantly, see if anyone puts their hand up and says, I can't watch that, it's crap. Because that's important too. We have chased quality for a long time, but, and this is an important anecdote, and I'm not going to name him because he'd be sacked, but one broadcaster who I put this to came up to me after the presentation and said, I am Golden Eyes for my company. I launched our UHD channel. My son came up to me last week and asked me if I could enable 4K on our home TV. I asked him what he was on about. He was trying to watch some RIP DVD or something. It turned out he'd been watching his 4K TV in 2K mode for 2 years, and he was the Golden Eyes for his national broadcaster. So we have to ask some questions, and the LESS Accord is about giving engineers permission to ask the seemingly stupid and say, well, why do I want a 16K TV when, to know if I'm getting a 16K picture, I need to put a VMAP analyzer on it? There's just no point. So if that over-engineering results in using more energy, well, let's not. And at least let's not do it by default. We don't have to take away consumer choice. It's the internet. It's wonderful. Press a button, you can have anything. But we shouldn't necessarily be pumping it out to every digital signage device, or every TV in the corner of a kitchen, or every sports bar with no one in it. Put it on when the sports bar's full, but not all the time. Sorry, I wanted to just finish on that. Once we've met, we're going to define the tests. We're going to put the tests forward once they've been designed at IBC. IBC is sort of big brothering us, so come to IBC, come and find out how we've got on at the end of the summer. We're going to describe those tests and wait for a final kicking to see if anyone spots any faults. And then Q4, Q1, we're going to run those tests in anger over the winter period to see if we can actually make any differences and bring that end result to Burbank, where we're going to have a sort of finale event with some Hollywood cinematographers. It's kind of a bit of fun, but it's to really raise the profile of what we're doing in the States because, as we all know, spending money lobbying Congress is a waste of money. So I've kind of said most of what's on these slides. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through them. What I want to do is get to that slide so you can point your phones at it and log the URL. If you've got a wacky idea or you've got a complaint or a criticism or you think it's stupid or you think it's brilliant, please get in touch. And then towards the end of this month, we're going to go for a bit more engagement where we actually scope in the ideas and so on. So I've hit the wall on the dot. I don't know if you want to do any QA.
Thank you.